He said it into the microphone, and the whole hall exploded. But he had no idea who he had just called out. The ballroom at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas was suffocating with light. Rows of cameras blinked red. Journalists shouted over one another, and the air buzzed with the metallic hum of stage speakers. It was the day before the big MMA event, and the press conference was less about strategy and more about theater. Trash talk, rivalries, bravado polished for headlines. At the center sat a fighter everyone already knew by name. Young, brash, undefeated enough to think himself untouchable, he leaned into the mic with a grin that promised chaos. His shirt clung to him, tattoos flexed across his forearms, and the smirk he wore looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. Reporters lobbed the usual questions: training camp, expectations, predictions. He gave the answers people expected, until one journalist threw in a curve. There's been chatter online. Some fans wonder how you'd fare against legends from the past. Say, Chuck Norris? The fighter laughed, head tossed back, voice amplified in the speakers. Chuck Norris, he barked. That guy could maybe make memes about himself. In the cage, he wouldn't last 60 seconds. The room erupted. Laughter, whistles, scattered boos. Phones shot up to capture the moment. The cameras zoomed in, savoring the quote they'd feed to YouTube before the conference even ended. The fighter soaked it in, feeding the energy, waiting for silence just so he could go again. You heard me, he continued, leaning closer to the mic, knuckles tapping the table. One round. I'd break the so-called legend before he even figured out what was happening. He spread his arms wide, like an actor delivering his curtain line. Legends don't scare me. They're just stories people tell when they're afraid of the present. The laughter rose again, sharper, louder, but it wasn't unanimous. Across the hall, an older journalist lowered his notepad, eyes narrowed, and spoke into his mic without theatrics. Do you even understand who you just insulted? That question shifted the air. For the first time in the afternoon, the young fighter's grin faltered, if only by a millimeter. The room itself seemed to hesitate. Bright lights still burning, cameras still rolling, but an undercurrent of unease cutting through the noise. He recovered quickly, forced a chuckle, and waved the comment off. Please, he scoffed. Don't tell me you're buying into those myths, too. But the pause had already planted itself. By the time the press conference ended, the quote was everywhere. Clips clipped down to 20 seconds spread across Twitter like sparks. YouTube thumbnails screamed in bold letters, I'd break Chuck Norris in one round. Reaction channels dissected it before the fighter had even left the stage. Some laughed along, repeating the line like it was gospel. But others, older fans, martial artists who still remembered smoky gyms and early tournaments, were not amused. Their replies came sharp and fast. Careful. You don't know what door you just opened. Respect matters. By evening, hashtags tangled together. Chuck Norris was trending alongside one round. The fighter's followers flooded in with laughing emojis, but buried among them were the colder comments. He'll answer. Just wait. That night, sports anchors replayed the soundbite on loop. In every corner bar, on every muted TV above blackjack tables, the words scrolled in closed caption, In the cage, he wouldn't last 60 seconds. The young fighter basked in the coverage. He posted clips of himself laughing backstage, slapped them onto Instagram with captions like, The truth hurts, huh? The likes poured in, but so did something else, a storm of replies from people who weren't joking. He thought he'd won the room. What he didn't realize was that the room had only just begun to turn. And somewhere out there, far from the cameras, the silence of the man he'd mocked was already gathering weight. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, bellow. For 3 days, nothing. No statement, no tweet, no friendly clarification from a publicist. The quote kept playing on loops across sports shows and bar TVs, but from the man at the center of it came only quiet, thick, deliberate, like a curtain pulled over a window that everyone wanted open. The silence worked its way under skin. Morning panels filled the gap with speculation. A former fighter on cable asked if age had finally done what opponents couldn't. An anchor tilted her head and wondered if the legend was savvy enough to ignore bait. Scrolls of headlines flashed. Will he answer? Too old or too wise? The clips stitched themselves into rumor. A neighbor saw him jogging at dawn. A cousin's friend said his knees were shot. A producer swore he'd retired from everything except cameos and charity appearances. None of it stuck harder than the quiet itself. The young fighter used that vacuum like oxygen. He sat in a velvet booth at a club off the Strip, neon slicing the room into expensive colors, and did podcast after podcast with a drink sweating on the table. Look, he told a host, who nodded fast enough to keep sponsorships happy. If he doesn't respond, that tells you everything. Men who can, do. Men who can't, post throwbacks. He laughed. The mic caught ice rattling in his glass. Fans in the comments parroted him. If he's silent, he's scared. Day 2, he posed with tourists at a pool party. Someone handed him a foam cowboy hat. He put it on sideways for a photo and captioned it, "Legend costume, sold separately." At a private suite, he lifted a shot to the lens. "To 60 seconds, he said, and the room howled. That night, he signed gloves for a line of college kids smelling like sunscreen and late ambition. He played generous with selfies, quick with jokes, fluent in the language of temporary gods. Meanwhile, in places where cameras weren't invited, another routine ran on a different clock. A modest gym far from the Strip, fluorescent lights starting to hum, mats scarred by years of feet, opened before sunrise. He unlocked the door himself. Air cool as a refrigerator, rubber and disinfectant in the nose. He moved through warm-ups like muscle memory had a map, counted breaths instead of followers, corrected a teenager's stance with 2 fingers and a nod. When a kid apologized for a sloppy combo, he said, "You're here. That's the part that matters," then demonstrated the footwork again. No speeches, no slogans for merchandise. He bowed at the end of each drill like the ritual still meant something because it did. Word of the insult reached that room, of course. It always does. A student, 19, buzzing with nerves, asked the question everyone else avoided. "Sir, are you going to say something?" He wiped sweat from his eyes with a forearm and didn't stop moving. "Talking's easy," he said. "Showing up is harder." The kid nodded like he understood, and didn't. Back in Vegas, the fighters' team stoked the fire. They fed clips to friendly accounts, pumped the algorithm with music stings and text overlays. On one interview, he lifted his chin and said, "He knows where to find me." And commenters returned the volley. "He won't." Passed his sell-by. "If he was real, we'd have heard by now." But under those were colder replies that looked almost handwritten. "He hears." Patience. Weather doesn't argue with umbrellas. By the end of day 3, the silence felt like a drawn bow. The young fighter mistook it for surrender. He went on a late show and doubled down. "At this point," he told the host, "if he tries anything, it just helps me." Free promo. The band kicked a rim shot. The audience played along. It all felt easy, unsweaty, until it didn't. The video arrived without fanfare. No sponsor tags, no teasers, not even a title beyond the generic file name some intern forgot to rename. It was a single shot from a phone. The frame found him sitting on a wooden bench in a plain gym, cinder block wall behind him, a roll of athletic tape balanced by his knee. Fluorescence hummed overhead. In the corner, a mop leaned against a bucket like the set had fallen asleep, waiting for a crew that never came. He looked into the lens as if it were a person. No makeup, no lighting tricks. Lines around the eyes that come from decades of squinting at sun and sweat. Not from filters. Behind the camera, someone breathed once, then held it. "I heard your words," he said, voice steady enough to flatten the room you watched it in. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He didn't sell tickets. "See you soon." 8 seconds. That was all. No threats, no countdown clock, no profanity to clip for outrage reels. Just a tone that didn't ask for attention because it already owned time. It traveled the feeds faster than the insult had. People stopped mid-swipe. The ones who loved him sent it like a prayer. The ones who mocked him watched twice and said nothing the second time. Comment sections filled with the strangest mixture. Heart emojis stacked next to skulls. Veterans typing paragraphs about humility. Teenagers writing "oh" in lowercase like the sound a body makes when understanding arrives a beat late. Sports shows replayed it, confused by its lack of spice. A host tried to laugh and couldn't find the rhythm. "That's it," he said, and then, quietly, "That's it." In Vegas, even casino floors felt shifted by a degree. Dealers glanced at televisions instead of tips, and cocktail servers traded theories between trays. The fighter saw it on his phone after midnight, blue light cutting him into hard shapes in a hotel bed. He watched once with a grin, twice with his mouth tightening. On the third run, his thumb hovered over replay and didn't press. The room felt too loud suddenly. The AC, the hallway ice machine, his own blood. He set the phone face down, darkness sliding back into place, and told himself he'd sleep. But somewhere past the Strip's neon, in a quiet building with scuffed mats and a mop in the corner, a man had said 8 words without raising his voice. And the silence that followed didn't feel like surrender anymore. It felt like the sound a door makes before it opens. The Strip outside blazed with neon, but inside the arena the light had a different weight, colder, harder, designed to focus every eye toward the cage. It was fight night in Las Vegas, and though the card was stacked with professionals, the crowd's electricity fed on one thing only, the promise of an encounter no one expected to happen. Not a title fight, not even an official bout, but something stranger. A meeting of generations, a collision of words made flesh. The young fighter came first. His walkout was a performance in itself, crafted for the highlight reels. The bass shook the floor. A rap anthem shouted his name with each beat. He danced on the way to the cage, throwing mock punches at the air, pausing to flex tattoos under the strobe. His entourage followed with matching jackets, hands raised like campaigners selling victory before it arrived. Fans surged against the barricades, shouting his name, slapping at the air when he leaned close enough. Cameras drank in every second. Inside the cage, he spun once, kissed both gloves, and climbed onto the mesh. From up there, he screamed into the crowd, "1 round!" The chant caught in pockets. 1 round! 1 round! Half the arena gleeful, the other half sour with anticipation. He grinned at both sides. To him, any reaction was victory. Then the music stopped. The pause stretched, awkward enough to draw whistles. For a moment, it felt like a production mistake, until the next entrance revealed itself. No lights, no fireworks, no anthem, just a figure walking out from the tunnel, slow and steady. Chuck Norris. He wore no robe, no sponsors. Simple black warm-up pants, plain shoes, a white t-shirt that looked older than some of the men in the audience. No entourage trailed behind him. He didn't lift his arms, didn't wave, didn't point to the sky. He just walked, posture straight, gaze fixed on the cage ahead. The sound hit like a wave breaking. Not music, people, roaring, clapping, stomping, whistling. It wasn't unanimous. Some jeered, some laughed at the contrast. But the ovation that swelled from the older rows drowned everything else. You could feel it in your chest, like the building itself had joined in. When he stepped through the cage door, he didn't hurry. He placed each foot as if the ground required respect. He bowed once toward the referee, once toward the crowd, and then raised his chin. Not high, just level. The cheers surged again. The contrast with the showman across from him was physical, almost violent. One man burning for spectacle, the other radiating a stillness so complete it made noise sound frantic. They met at center. The young fighter smirked, leaning close enough that the mic caught fragments. "Welcome to the future, old man. Try not to break a hip." He laughed at his own line, showing teeth. Chuck didn't answer, didn't even blink. His eyes stayed on the young man's face, calm and steady, as if measuring something deeper than reach or weight. The effect was immediate. The crowd, mid-cheer, stumbled into silence. You could hear individual voices cut off, someone yelling, "One round," who never reached the second syllable, a group of friends booing until their mouths closed without sound. Thousands of people sat in sudden, heavy quiet because of one look. The referee stepped between them, repeating the instructions, but his voice barely touched the air. Nobody listened. Every eye was fixed on the stillness between the two fighters, a storm wound tighter with each breath. The young man tried again, whispering into Chuck's ear, but it didn't matter. The audience couldn't hear the words, only saw the smirk that followed. And they saw the way Chuck didn't flinch. That lack of reaction was louder than any comeback. Seconds crawled. The crowd leaned forward as one, sensing something had already begun, even though no glove had moved. The fighter bounced on his toes, grinning wider, trying to drag the moment back into his control. Chuck stayed rooted, spine straight, eyes sharp, the picture of a man who knew there was no rush. The bell hadn't rung yet, the fight hadn't started, and still, people in the back rows were gripping their seats, hearts racing, breaths held like they were already watching history. Then the referee glanced at both men, nodded, and stepped back. His hand chopped down. The bell rang. And the instant the sound cracked through the air, the arena understood. This wasn't going to be a fight. It was going to be something else. The bell cracked, the building roared, and then came the curious quiet that lives between first steps. Sound swelled around the cage, but inside it there was only breath and footfall, the faint squeak of resin on canvas. He fainted, sheared left, and the young fighter surged as if yanked by a cord. He came fast, pouring a four-punch entry, jab, cross, hook, cross, heels skipping, shoulders hot with adrenaline. Leather hissed through air. The cage wire thrummed with crowd noise. A low calf kick chased the hands, shin biting for the nerve. He wanted it done before the room finished blinking, wanted the clip to prove he'd called his shot. Chuck didn't answer with heat. He let the punches pass within polite distance, head slipping by a thumb's width, shoulders tilting like a door on a quiet hinge. He checked the kick with a neat lift of shin, foot landing exactly where it had started. No flinch, no lunge. He gave the distance the respect it demanded, and nothing more. "Finish him!" a knot of fans howled. From the upper rows, an older chorus started, slower, patient. "Chuck! Chuck!" The arena became weather systems colliding, taunts, chants, the ripple of bets recalculating in the cheap seats. On the big screens, the clock ticked 4:39. It already felt shorter. The kid blitzed again. He chained a level change to a body shot, came up with an elbow. He meant to hide in the clinch. Chuck framed the bicep with one forearm, found the wrist with the other, and drew a small circle that took steam out of bone, then stepped off at an angle that made the cage door look suddenly far away. Nothing flashy, efficient choices. The referee warned fingers. The kid pretended not to hear. He chased, cutting the corner, trying to pen the older man against the mesh. His team shouted angles. "Left! Left!" And he obliged, shoulder barging to close off the exit while the audience rose in their seats with him. For a breath, his weight pinned Chuck at the fence. Chuck's response was a shrug. Only a trained eye reads, head to the safe side, underhook blooming. A hip switch that moved the cage an inch without touching it. They were centered again before the crowd knew the geometry had changed. The kid threw his hands out, smiling too wide, as if to tell the room he had allowed it. He didn't allow it. He felt it slip. He doubled the jab and overset his right shoulder, looking for the sound a glove makes when it finds jaw. It found nothing. Chuck's lead foot refused the invitation, sliding outside like a chess piece that knows the board better than the player. The kid reset, blinked sweat from one eye, and decided to say something. Words the cameras couldn't hear, but the body could read. A dare, an insult, and "I'm still here." Chuck blinked once, slow. Breath in, breath out, then stillness again. The crowd felt the contrast in their ribs. One man waged war. The other played by rules only he seemed to know. Someone near the commentary table said, "He's not biting," and forgot they were mic'd. A woman in a glittering top stopped filming and watched with her hands, fingers catching at the air like she could feel distances change. The kid turned up the volume. He stitched a teep to the belly into a high kick that scraped hair, then crashed forward behind a swinging left that would have looked great if it had landed. It didn't. Chuck's guard didn't so much rise as arrive. The forearm rode the arc, the shoulder met the impact, and the punch died with dignity. The younger man grinned, nodded as if to say good one, and immediately crowded again. Noise rewarded him. Noise demanded more. What bothered him, he'd feel it later, was the refusal. Not of contact, but of tempo. Every time he tried to make it a brawl, Chuck made it a conversation with boundaries. He parried the word now with "not yet" and moved the punctuation. 3 minutes in, the kid's breath roughened. Not gassing, surprised. He had aimed to swallow this man in speed, and instead found a diet of air. He feinted a shot, rose with an overhand he threw from too far. Chuck gave an inch, then took an inch back, feet quiet. The chant split again. "One round!" in a ragged push. "Chuck!" in a low, steady drum. The cage became an instrument the crowd played badly. A glove licked the body. Another chased high. Chuck let the first kiss cloth and made the second miss. He answered with nothing. A micro-touch at the bicep to say, "I see you." It was worse than a counter. It was homework handed back without a grade. "Make him fight!" the kid's corner yelled, panic tucked in behind hype. He obliged, sprinting through an A to B line he believed in. Head off center, chin tucked, his best version of himself barreling into the future he'd promised. That's when Chuck interrupted the sentence. It was not a big shot. The crowd would later argue over what exactly it was because slow motion makes honesty slippery. A short, straight off the lead that split the entry. or a palm heel that kissed the sternum a finger above the solar plexus, or the faintest spear of two knuckles meeting the soft undernote of breath. Whatever the label, the effect was clean. The forward motion stopped. Not a knockdown. Not even a stagger. Just a halt, like a train whose brakes bite just enough to make heads tip forward in unison. The kid's mouth opened without a word, eyes widening by a degree his confidence couldn't hide. His chest forgot where to put air for half a beat. The sound the building made was strange. 20,000 people unlearning how to shout all at once. Chuck didn't chase it. He left the space intact. He withdrew the hand that had said no further and reset his feet as if writing a line under a sum. Enough. The referee's eyebrows climbed. The commentary desk fell into that rare broadcast silence where everyone at home leans in by instinct. For a heartbeat, you could hear the cage chain clink as it settled. You could hear the corner ice slosh in a bucket. You could hear the building think. The younger man took a step back that read like a glitch, shook his arms loose, and tried to grin. It came late. His fans shouted his name to cover the gap. The other half started chanting the one he'd mocked. The noise returned, but thinner. Like air after a storm's first drop, hits your skin, and you realize the sky isn't bluffing. He bounced on his toes as if nothing had happened. He told himself nothing had. He nodded to his corner. He told the referee he was good. Across from him, the older man breathed once, and the round went on. But the room had learned something, and so had he. The control wasn't in the hands swinging hardest. It was in the man who chose when the world could move. Round 2 began like a door slammed open by a storm. The horn hadn't finished echoing before the young fighter charged across the canvas, fists loose, eyes too wide. His corner had iced his neck, barked instructions, told him he was winning. But what clung to him wasn't confidence. It was the sting of that single touch in the first round. The strike that had stopped him cold. Not with power, but with control. He wanted to erase it fast, and the only way he knew was to swing harder. "Say something," he barked, throwing a jab more like a slap. He followed with another, then a chopping low kick. "Look at me when I talk to you." His voice cracked through the cage mic, but his rhythm broke with each word. Chuck didn't flinch, didn't respond. He moved with the same quiet geometry as before. Half steps that cut angles, a guard that absorbed shots without drama. His breathing stayed even, a steady rhythm against the chaos. His silence worked like a weight pressing on the younger man's chest. The arena fractured again. Half of it screamed for blood. "Finish him!" While the other half answered with a chant that didn't care for pace. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The call and response turned the cage into an argument of its own. The kid threw harder, faster. He snapped up with a left hook, sweat flying, teeth bared. Chuck's shoulder rolled just enough to let the punch scrape air. The kid laughed too loud, tried to sell the crowd on contact. "Got you," he said. Everyone watching knew he hadn't. Frustration bled into risk. He shot low, diving for a takedown from too far. His arms locked around hips, forehead buried under the chin, and he drove forward with everything he had. For a moment, the cage shuddered under their weight. The crowd erupted. This was it, the spectacle they wanted. His corner screamed, "That's it! Push! Push!" But the position didn't hold. Chuck's hands found the overhook. His feet made a small pivot, and his back slid along the fence with the efficiency of someone moving furniture without scratching the wall. The grip broke for a split second, and that was enough. Suddenly, they were back in the center. Chuck standing tall, breathing even, the kid red-faced and gasping. The explosion of sound was immediate. Disbelief, relief, awe. Thousands of throats releasing something they hadn't realized they were holding. At the commentary table, one voice cracked with a line he hadn't planned. "Never underestimate Chuck Norris's silence." It was corny, but it worked. The crowd screamed it back like a mantra. The young fighter heard it. His eyes flicked sideways toward the screen where his own face glared back, and the camera caught something new in them. Not rage, not certainty. Doubt, small but sharp. He tried to bury it under anger. "You running?" he shouted, circling with his arms loose, feigning calm. "Fight me!" He slapped at Chuck's gloves, trying to bait him. He threw a teep that thudded on hip bone. Chuck parried it away like brushing lint from a sleeve, pivoted, and gave back nothing but space. The crowd felt the shift. They weren't cheering punches anymore. They were watching breath, waiting for stillness to break. The fight had stopped being about damage. It had become about patience, and one man owned it. The kid surged again, desperate. He locked onto an overhook, tried to drive a knee. Chuck's hip turned at the last moment, his forearm barring the strike, his knee checking on the meat of the thigh instead of the joint. A small denial, but enough. The kid's mouth opened as if to swear, but he bit it back when Chuck flicked a jab. Not heavy, not meant to hurt, just to reset the center and remind him who was dictating the terms. The grin he threw the cameras didn't reach his eyes. Time thinned. Sweat glazed shoulders. Gloves left red streaks on forearms. The referee's warnings blurred against the crowd's chants. The kid's corner shouted lies they hoped would keep him moving. He's tired. He's slowing down. But from across the cage came the evidence. Chuck standing calm, towel draped but unused, chest rising and falling like a pendulum. The horn cut the noise, ending the round. The kid dropped onto his stool, chest heaving, sweat streaking into his eyes. His coach cupped his face, shouting, "You've got him! One more push!" But the camera zoomed close, and the lens betrayed him. His eyes told the truth. They weren't fierce anymore. They were searching, calculating, wondering how much longer he could pretend. Chuck didn't sit. He stayed on his feet, water bottle unopened, gaze steady, the same as he had looked walking into the arena. His silence wasn't absence. It was command. The crowd had changed, too. They no longer saw a flashy young striker mocking a relic. They saw a man unraveling in real time, and another who had turned stillness into a weapon. The duel wasn't of fists anymore. It was of character. And as the cameras swung back to the young fighter, sweat dripping down his chest, his jaw clenched too tight, his eyes betrayed the thing he couldn't afford: doubt. The commentator, voice hushed now, repeated his earlier line. This time, not as hype, but as truth carved into the night. Never underestimate Chuck Norris's silence. The horn for the final round was coming. Everyone could feel it, hanging in the air like a held breath. And both men knew it would not be just another round. The final horn sounded like a gunshot, and the crowd rose to its feet as one. No one stayed sitting. The arena had transformed into a furnace of noise, a living wall of heat and breath. Everyone sensed it. The last round wasn't going to be tactical. It was going to be decisive. The young fighter shot out of his corner with desperation, disguised as confidence. His gloves carved the air in wide arcs, combinations sloppy from fatigue but powered by anger. He threw a right hand that whistled over Chuck's shoulder, a left hook that scraped the guard, then a head kick that thumped against forearm. He kept coming, pouring everything into the storm. It was his last chance, and he knew it. "Finish him!" Voices shrieked from the cheap seats. His corner slammed their palms on the cage, urging him forward. The noise folded into one primal roar. For a moment, it looked like momentum had tilted, like chaos might drown the calm. Chuck didn't hurry. He stepped aside, just enough, his breathing still measured. He let the storm rush past him, hands raised not in panic, but in patience. His eyes never left his opponent's face, watching, waiting. The kid lunged again, this time with a wild overhand. Chuck dipped, slid right, and in that breath of space, something shifted. He didn't counter with a flurry. He didn't need to. He placed one strike, single, sharp, precise. It landed clean. The young fighter's forward motion stopped dead. His body folded before his mind registered what had happened. He crumpled onto the canvas, gloves catching nothing, eyes blinking wide and empty. For one surreal second, the entire arena went silent, thousands of people frozen in disbelief. Then the sound came back. It was volcanic. Cheers, screams, stomps, a wall of noise so heavy it rattled the cage itself. The commentary table dissolved into shouts. Fans threw their arms in the air. Some cried. Some laughed like they'd just seen a ghost. Chuck didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his fists or climb the cage. He walked calmly to where his opponent lay, knelt, and reached out. He helped him sit up, then leaned close, speaking into his ear. The cameras couldn't catch the words, but whatever he said made the young man's expression soften. He nodded once, quickly, almost ashamed, and dropped his eyes to the floor. The referee lifted Chuck's hand, but he didn't raise it high. He let it fall after a moment, stepped back, and bowed once toward the crowd. The arena was still shaking with noise, but his movement cut through it. He looked less like a victor and more like someone paying respect to the storm that had just passed. The chants started then, rising from one corner of the arena and spreading like fire. Chuck. 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 The sound had weight, reverence, memory. People weren't chanting for a knockout. They were chanting for what they had just witnessed. Silence turned into power. Patience sharpened into a blade. And still, Chuck didn't bask in it. He turned, gave his opponent a final nod, and walked slowly toward the cage door. No show, no parade. Just steady steps, each one louder in its restraint than any victory lap could have been. In the commentary booth, one voice tried to capture it, voice cracking through static. He dropped him with one punch, but the real knockout came earlier. The camera followed Chuck's face as he left, calm, unreadable, carrying the same silence he had brought in. The crowd screamed his name, but in the center of all that noise lay the truest sound of the night, the quiet inside the fight. And the narrator's words, low and final, left the audience with the only truth that mattered. He fell to a single strike. But the real knockout had already happened, when Chuck Norris proved that true strength is always silent.